Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. As has been said, I work with biorational biopesticide technologies, and I work from discovery all the way through the product development process, through the registration process, and through them working with farmers and growers and how to implement the technologies. So, what I'd like to talk about today is let's just get lined up. Good. Is to talk about issues around the integration of biopesticides into an IPM program. So just by way of thinking about what our starting point is. So some work, I often have students and scientists coming to me and sort of saying, oh, well, this new technology. And I kind of was curious. I thought, well, when was IPM first conceived and first invented? And much to my surprise, it's a concept that goes back to the 1950s. So this isn't something new, but it is certainly something that we're now really working to implement, and we're trying to implement. And FAO came up with the definition. So that's the Food and Agriculture Organization, which is part of the United Nations. And what they in particular are driving towards is proactively favoring the registration. So there's the use of less hazardous products where available, products where such alternatives are viable and available. The technologies I'm talking about there's four categories broadly usually talked about. There's the macroorganisms, which are also called biocontrol, natural enemies, beneficials, microorganisms, then the botanicals, natural substances, and semiochemicals. Now, these last three categories are generally what we refer to or what are thought of as biopesticides. They may also be called biorationals, biologicals. There's no global definition about for these technologies, so you'll see these names and words used interchangeably. The closest we can get to some global definitions are these that come from the IBMA, so that's the International Biocontrol Manufacturers Association, which is a trade association to represent biocontrol producers. It's based in Europe, but it works globally. And so they, after much consideration, it took about 3 years, came up with these definitions as a way to understand what we're talking about. What we're clear about these biological technologies is that the market for them is really increasing fast. So these are figures from 2021, but I could show you the same figures and they'll say the same for 2022, 3, 4. So it's very clear that the global market for biorationals is growing very fast. Possibly not at the 20%, but certainly well above the 10%, and most estimates are running about the 50%. So there's a demand from farmers, from growers for these technologies. And we can see from this very complicated picture, which you won't necessarily be able to read, but I want to represent just how many companies are now involved in biopesticides or biological solutions. There's sometimes a confusion between biopesticide and biostimulant. A biopesticide is something that is used to manage the pests and diseases. A biostimulant is something that is working to improve the health of the plant. And they have different regulatory pathways, different uses, they're different technologies. But what this picture shows is just how many organizations, companies, how much research, how much innovation there is in biocontrol, and how fast this is growing. And if we take something like the EU, of about 500 plant protection products that are registered in the EU, nowadays over 40% of those are what we'd call the biocontrol technologies. So there's a lot of technology out there. And if we take the example of Brazil, which is a really lovely example, they've got more than 600 biocontrol products registered for over 200 targets. And we tend to think in Brazil that of biocontrol that it's used in specialty crops, it's used in indoor situations, in high-value crops. In Brazil, this isn't the case. This has been used in broadacre. And I think that's something to just ponder, that we think of biopesticides often as something that's only applicable to high-value horticulture. That's not the case. Horticulture is actually a good adopter of new technology. It's a good adopter of new ideas, and because of the pressure the industry is under to be competitive, it's constantly reinventing. So that's why we see biopesticides strongly associated with the horticulture industry. But in fact, they work exceedingly well in the open environment. And the case in Brazil is proof of that. And some of the reason why Brazil has been so successful in getting more products into the marketplace is actually they changed their regulatory system. And they changed their regulatory system in about 2013, 2014, and sped up the process of making products available. And it shows that if you have that facilitating regulatory environment, the products can become available, and then you have significant use of the products. And we know that from farmer surveys, 98% of the farmers who are surveyed have said that they would use biocontrol again, and they're happy with biocontrol. So it's created this very facilitating environment for pull through for all of these technologies. When we think a little bit more specifically about these technologies, one of the things that I often hear and people forget, especially when we're thinking about IPM, is that we're using these biopesticides, we're using them in an agro ecosystem. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to create as much diversity in that agro ecosystem as possible, because that's what creates resilience. So it's a diversity around the soil roots for microorganisms, it's diversity of the microorganisms around the plant itself, the diversity in the natural enemies. And when we're putting biopesticides in there, what we're trying to do is increase the biodiversity, because we're dealing with a very complex system with a lot of complex interactions, and we're trying to work against this to move it in favour of the crop rather than in favour of the pest. And we tend to think of biocontrols often as something that kills the target. It's a plant protection product because that comes from the thinking of the chemical paradigm and a chemical-based plant protection system. But what we see emerging now with and being implemented into IPM is things like this example I've got here. So this is some work done in Norway where they were able to show that wheat produces a pheromone which attracts lacewings, which come and eat the aphids. So you're not actually killing anything, you're managing the environment. And that's one of the key principles in integrated pest management, is that you're trying to manage the environment that you're working in. And what's happened in that environment then is they've planted flower borders to look after the lacewings. And then the farmers who are using this system are taking the lacewings from the neighbouring farmers. So what's then happened is an increase in building these flower borders, building these reservoirs for the lacewings, and they've really increased the ecosystem biodiversity and encouraging more natural enemies such as the bees to come into the system. So you then create this virtual circle of how the IPM can work really well. And there's an interesting report done by the Institute of European Environmental Policy that looked at biocontrol and looked at all the benefits of biocontrol. And the benefits weren't just in terms of what I've described about the ecosystem service, weren't in terms of the plant protection benefit that you're getting, but in terms of biocontrol enhancing the soil life, because the products used as biopesticides tend to have a lower risk profile. There's less exposure of farm workers to toxic chemistry. There's less residues in the food, so there's a net benefit from operating a biointensive, a biocontrol-based IPM approach. So we think about integrated pest management and what is this and how is this described? And so I quite like the way this description here, where what we think about with IPM is the first thing we do is think about agronomic practices. What is the soil? Are we growing the right thing in the soil? Have we looked after our soils? Are we putting the right variety in the right place? Have we got resistance? Are we working a good rotation on the farm? And then the next step is to say, okay, we know that pests and diseases will arise, so let's monitor those, let's look at those. And with the rise of digital agriculture, with the rise of good sensing, we can see better and better monitoring, forecasting, not just on a landscape scale, but on individual farms and individual fields. So there's a really good understanding of what the pests and diseases are. To the extent that this is beginning to sort of hit the amount of crop protection inputs are needed, where crop protection inputs are perhaps going into part of a field rather than the whole field. They're not being put in prophylactically, they're being put in time to the pest or disease appearing. And this is a particularly important aspect with biopesticides, as I'll pick up later, about the timing and how and when you use biopesticides. Then the next step in the IPM is thinking about physical and natural interventions. What's the simplest thing we can do to stop this pest and disease arising? And that's where you've got something as simple as putting fleece over carrots to stop carrot fly getting into the carrots. A very simple intervention. And then you come in with your biological interventions. So this is where the natural enemies, where the biopesticides come in. So I've tried all these other mechanisms, and the biological interventions come in. And then the current picture of IPM, which is actually changing quite a lot, says we have chemical interventions when things get out of kilter. There's a conversation at the moment as to whether we really need the chemical interventions, but the idea is that is your plant protection of last choice. And I think that there's a lot of wiseness in there, is that we need to look after the chemistry. We need to look after what we've got so we don't overuse, so we don't build resistance. So we need to be much more thoughtful. So this is the general way in which integrated pest management is seen to operate and seen to have the role for biological. And the biological intensive IPM is that second to last step, where you're bringing in as many interventions as you can. And it's not about one intervention, it's layering those interventions in. So I did some work a few years ago. I worked with UK growers. I also do work across Africa, US and Australasia. So a lot of what I'm saying is informed by those experiences. So I wanted to understand what are the reasons for uptake of biological technologies. And interesting, I asked this of groups at different times, and I obviously can't ask you today, but perhaps just reflect as I'm talking here what you think might be those reasons. These were all the reasons that we came up with. What I find very interesting is the top two, that the technology actually works, are often the two that get missed off when people think about this list. But looking at some of those lower in the list, we can think about some of the reasons why the biopesticides used, and I hadn't thought of this before, is one of the things that some of the strawberry growers have said to me is that because these technologies have no re-entry interval or no plant harvest interval, it means they can manage the workforce better, because their workforce can get back into the crop and keep managing it, and or picking and harvesting, so that you can have harvesting in time to when the crop ripens, rather than being held out of the greenhouse or out of the crop getting overripe, then you have to dispose of overripe material. So that's a real advantage, and also an advantage in managing the workforce and being able to utilize the workforce across the farms more efficiently, because you haven't got long periods where they can't get back into the crops. And I hadn't first thought of that. So it's this idea that integrated pest management is a whole farm practice, and that using biorationals, using biopesticides really supports this on-farm practice. There's something we come across when I'm working with biopesticides and thinking about the problems we have of how we integrate biopesticides into IPM is do they work and do they measure it? And I'm often here saying, but I don't get 80%. You don't, but you never, and you're never going to, because the nature and the complexity of the interactions between the biopesticide and targets means it's rare to get that. It's not to say it doesn't happen, but it doesn't happen all the time. But neither do you need 80%. And that's the whole point of the IPM system. So a lot of the products on the market are not giving you 80% control, but you don't need that. That idea that you need 80% comes from the chemical paradigm of plant protection. Whereas you're operating a biointensive IPM program, you don't need that level of effect. What you're trying to do is reduce and manage the population below a damage threshold. What we need to think about when we think about something is working, what do we mean by the efficacy? Do we mean the 80%? Do we mean how this will work in my IPM program so it doesn't disturb my other interventions? What's the interaction of my biological biopesticide with the chemical pesticides in the system? What are the effects that I'm looking for? Are there disadvantages with the technology that I'm using? What are the advantages? So we don't necessarily break it down and think of it in this way, but when we're choosing biopesticides to work with an IPM program, these are all the things that we're considering. So going back to this question of do do biopesticides work? What level should you get in trials? If I was in the room, I could ask you this question. I could ask you to put your hands up. But what is the level that's acceptable in trials? So the first thing is what level should you get in trials? And most people say to me it's going to be over 75%. What level is acceptable to the farmers? People say again 75%. And what do the regulators need? 75%. So just teasing that apart, I've already discussed that you don't need that over 75%. What you need is you need a product to be effective enough to reduce the population below the damage threshold. And that may only be a 20% reduction is all you need. And by using something that doesn't disturb your IPM system, that product is the right product that you need at that time. Then we go to the farmers and say, what does the farmer want? It's the same. He's the same. He's looking for something that reduces the pest population. He's not necessarily looking for 75%, but work I've done with farmers are really clear. What they want is consistency. They need to know the level of effect they're going to have and how that level of, so they can then implement that well into their IPM program. And then regulators do not need above 75%. You can make a case to have a lower level of efficacy, and that's acceptable. And indeed, many of the products that are now registered do have lower levels of efficacy than that. So if we take this example of some products that are registered here in the UK or in Europe, this is the level of efficacy that the companies said that they can obtain with their products. So you look at them, there's only a few that go above the 80%. And if you're looking at needing something that gives you consistent control at 50%, they all do that. So this is the principle about you don't need to kill everything in sight, you need to manage the population. If we look at this model, ideally, if the farming practice is good and is monitoring, you're looking at the light green line where the farmer can see that the population is beginning to change at sort of time 3, comes in with an intervention and keeps the population down before it gets very high. But the blue line, the darker blue line, is what usually happens. We've perhaps not noticed that the population's increasing, or the monitoring's not worked so well, or the weather changes and suddenly you get a population explosion. So you need to come in with the intervention. What I've modelled here is a product that has a 30% effect, and I've assumed a 15% increase in population between time. What it clearly shows you that if you have a 30% effect and have repeat applications 3 times, simplistically, you've had a 90% effect and you've come below that damage threshold. So this is the principles of what we're trying to do with IPM. So it's a different way of thinking. We're not trying to kill everything at once. We're trying to just manage the populations. And an advantage of this multiple approach is that if you are only managing, say, the neonates or the early stage larvae, and you haven't got a synchronous population, that each time you go in, you take out that percentage of the population, you do that 2 or 3 times. Now, the big question is how to do that economically. And that's where the focus needs to be. What product can I use and how can I do that economically? And the other principle to think about is what's our dose response curve. So the grey line is what we'd normally expect for a single molecule chemistry, conventional pesticide. But all the other lines represent the different types of dose response curve we'll get for other technologies. So the light blue line is a semiochemical. You can increase your dose and you have no effect until you have all of your effect. So we need to understand that dose effect relationship well to implement biopesticides well. But there's absolutely no doubt about it that these technologies have a certain variability. So this is some trials that I did with a product to test it against, in this case, botrytis on strawberries. So this is the perfect trial result where if you look at the green bars, as I increased dose from 1 litre to 2 litres to 4 litres per hectare, the pest population went down. But the reality is you also get this. And so the results are quite messy. And this is what I'm saying, the farmer needs the consistency. So how do we manage that variability? How do we create something and use something in a way that doesn't have that variability? Now, these were trials that were really carefully managed, and we still get this inherent variability, which is one of the problems with the technologies. And what we have to work out is how to use the technologies well and manage the variability. And we can manage the variability by considering all of these factors here. And one of the things that might be very useful for this group is there was a UK project funded by growers, and it's called AMBER, the Application and Management of Bioprotectants for Efficacy and Reliability. And it looked at how to particularly make applications into greenhouses. And it was kind of a challenge between scientists and the growers, and some growers very kindly volunteered their farms for this project. And what we were looking at is if we can manage the timing of applications well and the way in which we apply biopesticides well, can we improve the reliability and the efficacy? The project's now finished, but the links here will take you to a series of webinars which explain what happened on this project. And some of the really interesting take-homes were that we tend to apply products with 1,000 litres per hectare. But we found if you reduced it down to 500 litres per hectare, in some cases there was a 35% improvement in efficacy by using less water, by getting the application right. It also became really clear that the application needed to be absolutely right for the life stage of the target, whether it's an insect or a disease. And what this project showed is that because you don't have toxic substances, because you don't have persistent substances, which is generally the case for biopesticides, your margin for error are much less. So actually you have to be a much better crop protection specialist for working with biopesticides, and biopesticides are really good at finding out when you're not doing things well. But I won't go into all the details, but this is a free and open resource, and I think listening to some of those webinars will really be informative and maybe useful for helping to understand how to use biopesticides well and the problems there are. So I just want to sort of sum up and say with biopesticides, it's a different approach to crop protection or plant protection. It's a different approach to integrated pest management. They're technologies that do have variability. They're technologies that are not going to kill everything inside. But this is the modern plant protection technique. They require a lot of knowledge. They require good monitoring and sensitivity. They are not technologies that you can put in and forget. They're technologies you can put in. You need to be very thoughtful about when you use them and how you use them. And there's no doubt about it, it's really knowledge intensive. To operate this kind of IPM, you need to be really well educated with all of these disciplines coming together. And I don't deny that you still do need some chemistry. If it gets out of kilter, that you need to use chemistry to tell me. So I hope that short talk has been useful and informative, and that there's some useful messages in that. Thank you.